Welcome back to My Life. I'm your host, Ed Brakefield, and I'm with my good friend Charlie Peringian. We were talking in the last segment about his life in the automotive industry and how he rebuilt the auto bodies. And he came out with a special paint, didn't come out with it, but he used a special paint where he could tear the cover off and repaint it in different colors. Now, Charlie, you had more hobbies than just cars and painting cars. You had Corvettes. You were part of the Corvette or Camaro group. You had Amphicars. Tell us about the Camaros a little bit.
Well, back in the day, back in the early 70s, I had two Camaros that were called Copo Camaros, where they were special order from Chevrolet. They were limited production. They made approximately 1,000 cast iron cylinder block Copo Camaros, and they made 69 aluminum block Camaros. I had two of the cast iron block Camaros, and they were 427s from the factory with no markings on them. You wouldn't know what they were walking by them. They had to be special ordered. Not too many people knew about them. They had to go through Chevrolet central office. The two that I owned, they came from a Chevy dealer called Emmert Chevrolet that was over on 6 Mile and Grand River. And Copo Camaros came in different versions. There was a version that also had a special suspension, which they called double Copo Camaros, that had sports car suspension, chambered exhaust system, 140 mile an hour speedometers. Both of mine were had the sports car suspension as well as the 427 special engine. One I had was a rally sport model. Not too many Camaros were the rally sport models, and it also had special paint. It was painted Corvette white from the factory, where the tag on the firewall said blank blank. The reason why that one got produced was that crossed a person's desk that I know that worked at central office, and for him to order the car, he was in the paint division. He had to order it with special paint, and so that's how that one got its beginnings. When I worked for the drag racers, we actually took one of my Copo Camaros to Lapeer Dragway. Actually, it was on my 21st birthday in 1970, and my boss had a brand new 70 Camaro race car, and he wanted to test it at Lapeer Dragway, and he rented the track on a Wednesday afternoon. I remember the price was only $50 for us to be there to rent the track. And my boss says, Charlie, why don't you bring your Camaro, and if we have any extra time, he says, we'll see what the Camaro could do. And my boss had kind of helped me with my Camaro. He did some carburetor jetting and some work to the distributor. We put headers on the Camaro, and it had a scatter shield and traction bars, and I had a 7-inch slicks on it. And so we took the Camaro as well as this race car to the drag strip this one Wednesday. Unfortunately, I had problems with this race car where after a couple passes down the track, it broke. So he says, let's fool with the Camaro for a while. Oh. So we ran the Camaro, and it went 12:58, I think was the best time, which was pretty good back then for a factory new car. And that's why they were kind of special. And then on the way back home, it was my 21st birthday. We stopped in Oxford, Bill's Bar, and I had my first legitimate beer.
Oh, to celebrate that,
Yeah,
huh?
to celebrate it, yeah.
Okay, and then you also have, other than your hobby of the cars and the Camaros, you had something very unique to a lot of people, were the Amphicars.
Yeah, I had these little cars for a while that went in the water. They were called Amphicars. And I always thought they were kind of unique. And in my travels, I think it was around in the middle 70s, I ran across one that was just parked at Sylvan Lake in a trailer park. And one of my friends was driving, and I spotted this car, and I said, stop the car. I says, we got to go back. And so we went back to where this Amphicar was, next to this trailer, and I started writing this guy a note saying that I was interested in buying this car if he wanted to sell it. And as I was writing the note, he happened to pull up to the trailer, and so I got to talk to him in person. And it took a little doing, and I paid a little bit more than I thought I needed to pay for it, and it didn't run, but I bought this Amphicar. And then, so I dragged it back to my body shop. I was just starting out with my business, and I was working with the auto racers in their building, and I dragged it back to the shop, and I started looking through this Hemmings Motor News, which is the Bible for old cars. You can find whatever parts you need. This Amphicar needed some parts, and I found an ad where someone was advertising parts for sale. So I ordered the parts that I needed to get my car running, and so I'm waiting and waiting, and one day this jolly older fellow walks into my shop and with this big box in his hand, and he says, I was coming home for the Christmas holidays, and he says, I thought I'd save you the freight bill, and so I brought you the parts.
Really?
And so I got to be friends with him a little bit, and it turned out that he had bought the inventory from the plant where these cars were produced in the 60s in Germany, and 10 semi-loads of parts, and shipped them to California where he lived, except for he had a cottage in the summertime in Traverse City. And before I knew it, I made friends with this guy, and he had me fixing Amphicars that he'd find in his travels here and there, and he'd pay me in brand new parts.
Wow.
And so I wound up with all kinds of parts, body panels, interior parts, mechanical parts. Year after year, he'd bring me a car or two to fix, and then again, he'd pay me in parts, not in money. And in my travels, my friends would find other Amphicars sitting on the sides of the road or whatever, and they'd say, Charlie, I found you another Amphicar. And reluctantly, I'd go look and say, well, I really don't need any more Amphicars, but somehow I'd buy it and drag it back home. And so I wound up with like 6 of them.
Now, for those people that don't know what an Amphicar is, can you describe it to the people, what an Amphicar is and how it works?
Well, it's kind of a small car. It's a convertible. It's got the motor in the back of the car in the trunk area. And if you look underneath the car, there's a couple propellers. And so all the mechanics are to the rear of the driver, the transmission and the motor. And it's a matter of, there's just a little lever on the floor, like a 4-wheel drive older truck would have, where you push the lever back and the propellers start to work.
So did you used it in the park and wetlands area? We'll get into that segment next. I wanted you to tell us about your parks and your love for the parks in the next segment. So if you will, I'd like to take a break right now and get into the parks. And this is Charlie's desire, is to talk about the parks and how it fits. So we'll be right back in just a little bit.
It's a short ride from your neighborhood to your naturehood. To find a neighborhood park or green space near you, visit discovertheforest.org.
There are those who dedicate themselves to a sense of honor, to a life of courage, and a commitment to something greater than themselves. They have always defended this nation and each other. They still do. The few, the proud, the Marines.
We're back with my friend Charlie Peringian, and we were talking about the Amphicar, and The Amphicar goes into the water. How do you keep it from leaking when you open up the door?
Well, it had an extra lever on the doors and hood and trunk that you would fasten that would make it leak tight, that would close it just a little bit extra to make it tight so it wouldn't leak. And they also had bilge pumps just in case they leaked a little bit. The bottom of the car would collect that water and you could suck it out with the bilge pump.
Yeah, so you really enjoyed taking your Amphicar to lakes and where parks are and everything like that. Did you get any involvement, or tell us about your involvement when you with the Addison Township portion of the parks, in parks in the wetland area and everything like that?
Oh, how I got involved with the
Yes.
parks? Well, back in 1990, I used to get this magazine from the Michigan United Conservation Clubs, the MUCC, and I was reading it, I believe it was like in February of 90. There was a small article in there that the state was looking for areas high in natural features close to large metropolitan areas to possibly become parks. And the program was through the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund, which is a fund that gets $30 to $40 million a year from oil and gas lease money from lands up north that they rent to the oil companies. So they have money. And I read the letter. I lived close by to where Watershed Park is today, which was owned at the time by developers who wanted to put 60 to 100 houses on that property and a golf course. And I thought perhaps it was worth a shot at writing a letter to the state of Michigan saying I knew of an area that was high in natural features, because a couple years earlier I had received papers from the state of Michigan where state biologists actually ground surveyed where I live and Watershed Park, and I had a copy of the ground survey, and it said that it was high in natural features and it had rare and endangered plant and animal communities, which made it a likely candidate for what the state was looking for. So I wrote them a letter and I explained the story that I knew of a property, developers owned it, and it would be nice if the state bought it and gave it to Addison Township. And so I sent them the letter and I got a response back saying that they were very interested. I was happy to see that, and I took it to the township and I showed it to our then supervisor, and he explained to me that we were being sued by the developers, and that he thought it was a great idea, and anything I could do to promote it would be good, but the township couldn't get too involved in it because we were being sued.
That made a lot of sense.
Meanwhile, the developers were persistent on trying to break the zoning. It was in a part of the township that was called a fragile watercourse district, an area of less development, and an area where the zoning was at a minimum of 10 acres. And the developers weren't getting anywhere with the local township boards because they would keep bringing back that there was a large wetlands at that area, and the underground water in Addison Township needed to be protected because the underground water in Addison Township flows south, and that was our aquifer, and perhaps a golf course might pollute our drinking water. And meanwhile, as the developers saw that they weren't getting anywhere with zoning breakdown, we changed administrations where I went to our new supervisor that I had never met before, and I explained what I was trying to do, and if the township could now do anything. And he said that he thought it was a wonderful idea, and he said, let me see what I can do. And he said, perhaps I can talk to developers, get them to do a pause in their lawsuit against the township, a truce, and maybe we can apply for this money. because a governmental body needed to sponsor this property for the state to relinquish the money.
Yeah, that was Bob Koski at that
Yeah,
time, wasn't it?
that was Mr. Koski. And so in 1994, Mr. Koski formed a park committee, kept the truce going with the developers, and we applied for a grant. In 1997, we got the grant, and it was very high on the list from the trust fund, and we got nearly $3 million for Watershed Preserve Park. We were all very happy. It's approximately 230 acres. Again, it's high in natural features. The park is to be that way for perpetuity, which is a big word that means always forever, which makes me feel good. Any work that we do out there, we know that the park's going to stay that way. So future generations in Addison Township can see what it used to look like.
Now, that park is pretty important because it's got water. There's 4 rivers. Is it 4 rivers coming from it?
Well, it's according to the Army Corps of Engineers, it's the headwaters for 3 river systems. The terrain in Addison Township towards the north end of the township is rather highly elevated, and the water runoff and the underground springs, the water's going in 3 directions. The west portion of Watershed Park is going more towards the Flint River, the south branch of the Flint River. The north and the east portions are going to the Bell and the Clinton River watersheds. So the Army Corps of Engineers identified it as the headwaters of all 3.
So Addison then did fill out all the paperwork that needed to be done, and we ended up getting it.
Yes.
Getting the park. And then that was one trophy under your belt of fighting for that. Then you went to another park or lake, which was Lake George area.
Well, in the early 2000s, there was quite a development boom in the Oxford Addison area, and another property that was part of the same chain of lakes as Watershed Preserve Park, which we call today Lake George Nature Park, came up for sale. It was owned by the original family of settlers. It had the original deed. Mom and Dad had passed on, and the 2 sons had moved out of state, and the house was up for sale, and it was on approximately 80 acres. It was an orphan piece of property. And again, it was on a list high of natural features identified by state biologists. And I went to the township, and I explained to our supervisor then, Mr. Koski, that it was for sale, and perhaps maybe we needed to do something with that. Again, it's help the small kettle lakes on these properties with the large wetlands. That's the aquifer for our drinking water. These parks are a place for the animals to live. They have to have a place to live too. And it helps keep us rural.
Now, what's interesting, Charlie, is all of this, the park acquisitions, cost the township people nothing, did it? It all came in from grants that you guys worked on.
Well, Lake George Park was an interesting project. The township moved forward on trying to acquire Lake George Park, but there's a 25% match that the local community needs to pay when they get a grant from the trust fund. The property was for sale for, I believe it was $1.25 million at the time. And so the township would have had to pay some money if they got the grant. The first 2 times we applied for it, the township board was willing to do that. But the economy took a downturn in 2006, 2007. And the township board decided not to proceed on another grant application because they didn't want to pay the match. Not because they didn't want the property, but they thought it was important to be frugal at that time. I talked to Mr. Koski about it, and he says, Charlie, go out and see if you can find somebody that can help us with the match. Otherwise, we're going to have to give up on getting Lake George property. So I'm a longtime member of the It was called the Oakland Land Conservancy at the time. Now it's called Six Rivers Conservancy and the Clinton River Watershed Council, and since about 2000. I talked to both groups. They thought it was a wonderful idea. And the Oakland Land Conservancy said, let's see what we can do. And so we partnered up with the Oakland Land Conservancy, now Six Rivers, and they said that they would help us. They found a group to buy Lake George Park, turn it over to them, and us to apply for a grant later, and they would take care of the match portion so Addison Township wouldn't have to pay anything. It took a few years to do that, but we did get Lake George Park, and we got it absolutely for free.
Isn't that great? That's how a citizen like you can go out and fight for something that's going to live with the township forever and ever, and you're just part of it.
Well, I just happened to be there at a time where these properties needed a little help, and I just kind of thought it was the right thing to do. And again, all of us should try to make the world a little bit better whenever we see the opportunity to.
So, Charlie, you really assisted on getting Lake George property at no cost to the township, and you were a major contributor to Four Lakes. Is it called Four Lakes or Watershed?
Watershed Park.
Watershed Park. Now tell us a little bit about Watershed and what it has to offer the township and people involved.
Well, again, Watershed Park does a lot of important things. One is it helps keep our drinking water clean with the small lakes and the large wetlands around them. That's the aquafilter for our drinking water that flows south in the township. It's a place for the animals to live. If you want it to be somewhat wild, you have to have a place for the animals to live. It's good for hiking. We allow boating. There's limited bow and arrow hunting. So there's passive recreation there, and it helps keep the township rural. It has a nice trail system that's approximately about 2 miles. There's maps at the entrance box at the head of our trails, just right by our parking lot. The trails have approximately 40 markers where if you have an emergency, you could be found. Mm-hmm. There's a Verizon cell tower in the parking lot which gives you good phone reception. There's no two places in the park really look the same because it's got this broad type of vegetation and terrain. So it's a real nice park, and it's always to be that way, always forever, for perpetuity.
Now that park is on Rochester Road, north of the village of Leonard.
Yes.
And you can find it because you can see the Verizon cell tower, but in the parking lot is a building, the old school. I believe that was
yes, Arnold Schoolhouse. Yes. And Ed, you were very helpful with Arnold Schoolhouse, help getting it moved. Arnold Schoolhouse was built, I believe, 1856. It was on Lakeville Road by the intersection of Lakeville and Hosner Road, next to a white church that's still there. The building was in dire need of repairs, where it got to the point where it was unsafe and the fire department condemned it. It looked like the building was going to get demolished, but the citizens that lived in the area said the building was important to them. Their grandparents and their relatives went to school there, and if it was at all possible, it was worth the opportunity to try to save it. Our township leaders thought it was a very good idea. They passed the hat around and got private donations, formed a committee, which Ed was on, to help move the schoolhouse, and had the schoolhouse picked up and moved to Watershed Preserve Park late in the fall, about 10, 11 years ago, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. By the time the building got there, there wasn't a whole lot left of it because some of it fell apart going up Rochester Road, but we were able to piece it back together. Supervisor Pearson found people to volunteer their time to help preserve it, where today it's back together the way it was before, but actually a little bit better.
Yeah.
And a lot of the local people that had artifacts from the school, the bell, the desk, the blackboard, whatever, donated all the stuff back, where a lot of the original pieces inside the schoolhouse are all back there. We put a basement in underneath the schoolhouse where we keep our park shovels and tools for park maintenance. And so that's the headquarters for our parks. And in the summertime, we have our Park and Recreation Committee meetings there.
Okay, that's really, really interesting because it's welcome to our township in the park line. Now, part of this, the park, I want to ask about your vegetation and everything is very sensitive to you on that, isn't it?
Well, the world has become a little bit smaller, it seems, with airplanes and boats. Some plants from other parts of the world have invaded this part of the world and in Addison Township, where they're called invasive species. There's 3 of them that come to mind right away that I think of, that I see rapidly growing at Watershed Park, Lake George Park, and in our own backyards. One is called autumn olive, and those are bushes that have little thorns on them. The bottoms of their leaves are kind of silvery, and they kind of try to crowd out other native vegetation and take over. So that's one. Another one is this Oriental bittersweet. It looks like Michigan bittersweet, which is quite scarce and hard to find, but this bittersweet came from the Far East China area and likes to completely take over certain areas. It really likes sunny areas a lot. It has a rapid sideways root system and also has berries like the Michigan bittersweet, which when they drop on the ground become new plants. And the Oriental bittersweet likes to wrap itself around trees and actually drag them down once it starts to mature. And again, it grows real fast. You can see its limbs reaching out, trying to find something to cling on. Then we have another invasive plant called Phragmites, which grow in wetlands. They grow in areas that native cattails grow. They grow much taller where you can't really see that area anymore. And that's another bad invasive plant that wants to take over.
Okay, Charlie, so this is about to wrap up the segment, and tell the people what you would, the parks, once you have it, it's forever. So the people's involvement, what can they do to be involved?
Well, it's important to get involved in your local community. We're fortunate in Addison Township that we have approximately 20 park rangers that roll up their shirt sleeves when we have park ranger work days, and we do little park projects like clear our trails, do painting, things to improve our parks. That's important to get involved with your local community. We also use Oakland County WAB Community Service. We've been using them for 20 years. Those are like your next door neighbors, kids that perhaps got in trouble for the first time and they have to do some community service. We get those on a regularly scheduled basis. We've been getting those people for 20 years where they bring a van full of them for the day and they help us cut the grass, again, do painting, do light maintenance work, and it helps keep Addison Township looking nice.
Okay, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Charlie. You've been a wealth of information, and I know anyone that's listening to this will thoroughly enjoy it. I just want to thank you for showing up and giving us a little brief history of your life.
Well, thank you, Ed, for allowing me to do that.
Thank you.